For 3,000 years, he was a ghost, a shepherd who killed a giant, a poet who wrote the Psalms, a king who founded a dynasty that would define the spiritual geography of the entire world. King David is perhaps the most vibrant, complex character in the entire Western canon. But up until the early 1992, if you were a historian looking at the hard, cold ground of the Middle East, David didn't exist. He was a phantom. This is the paradox that haunted archaeology for decades. You could read about David in the Bible, you could see his legacy in the architecture of Jerusalem, but you couldn't find him in the dirt. There was not a single scrap of physical evidence, no pottery shards, no royal seals, no Egyptian letters that even whispered his name. And in the world of science, if you can't dig it up, it's not there. This silence birthed a radical movement in academia known as biblical minimalism. And you have to understand, these weren't conspiracy theorists. These were serious historians applying the scientific method. Their argument was brutal but logical. You cannot use the Bible to prove the Bible. That is circular logic. Without external validation, without a receipt from a neighbor or an enemy, King David was likely just a myth, a King Arthur figure invented by Jewish scribes hundreds of years later to give their people a glorious backstory. By the early 1992, the minimalists were winning. The consensus was hardening. David was fiction. The united monarchy was a fantasy. And then, on a hot July afternoon in 1993, a surveyor named Gila Cook looked down at a pile of rubble and saw something that would shatter that consensus into 1,000 pieces. The location was Tel Dan. It's a lush, green nature reserve in the far north of Israel, a place where the headwaters of the Jordan River rush through the ruins of ancient cities. For nearly 30 years, a legendary archaeologist named Avraham Biran had been peeling back the layers of this site. But by July 21st, 1993, the excitement was over. The digging season was finished. The team was packing up. They were tired. They were dusty. They were ready to go home. Gila Cook, the team surveyor, was doing one last sweep. She wasn't looking for treasure. She was packing up equipment. She happened to glance at a low, broken wall they had recently excavated. It was made of rough field stones, the kind of junk rock ancient builders used to patch holes. But one stone was different. It wasn't limestone. It was black basalt. And as the afternoon light hit the rock face, she saw shapes, not cracks, letters. She called Biran over. Avraham, look at this. Biran, a veteran who had seen it all, knelt down. He brushed away the centuries of dirt. He was looking at Old Aramaic, a specific script from the 9th century BCE. This wasn't a grocery list. This was a royal monument, a stele, that had been smashed by invaders and reused as garbage fill in a wall. They carefully pried the stone loose. It was heavy, broken, and jagged, but the words were clear. It was a boast, a victory lap, carved in stone by a foreign king bragging about killing his enemies. The team deciphered the lines. It mentioned a king of Israel. That was huge on its own. But then their eyes drifted to the bottom of the fragment. Line 9. 6 letters that would cause an earthquake in universities from Oxford to Harvard. Bet, Yud, Tav, Dalet, Vav, Dalet, BYTD, WD, Beit, David. The house of David. The shock in that room was palpable. Here, written in the script of a hostile enemy nation, was the name. Not David the shepherd, but David the dynasty. In the ancient Near East, You didn't name a kingdom after a myth. You named it after its founder. The Assyrians called the northern kingdom the House of Omri. And here, an Aramean king was calling the southern kingdom of Judah the House of David. This was the smoking gun. This was the receipt the minimalists said didn't exist. So who wrote it? That's where the story gets even darker. Based on the dating and the context, scholars are almost certain the author was Hazael, the king of Aram Damascus. If you read the Bible, Hazael is a nightmare. He's a usurper, a warlord who tore through the region with fire and sword. The stone is essentially Hazael's propaganda poster. The text is chilling. Hazael boasts, "I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Ahaziah, king of the house of David." Think about the irony. The only reason we have proof that David existed is because one of his family's worst enemies hated them enough to brag about killing them. Hazael didn't care about validating the Bible. He cared about glorifying himself. And in doing so, he accidentally preserved the history of the very people he was trying to destroy. Now, did the skeptics give up immediately? Of course not. Academia is a battlefield. When the discovery was published, the backlash was immediate and creative. Some scholars tried to argue that BYTDWD didn't mean House of David. They scrambled for alternatives. Maybe it meant House of the Uncle, or House of the Kettle, or maybe a place called Beit Dod. But these arguments fell flat. The context was too specific. You have a king of Israel mentioned right next to it. It's a parallel structure. If the first one is a kingdom, the second one is a kingdom. Reading it as the House of the Kettle isn't just a stretch. It's linguistically desperate. Over the next few years, as two more fragments were found, the House of David reading became the overwhelming consensus. The Tel Dan Stele didn't prove that David killed Goliath. It didn't prove he played the harp. Archaeology can't prove theology. But it did something arguably more important for historians. It moved David from the realm of folklore to the realm of fact. It proved that a century after he died, the kingdom ruling Jerusalem was still identified by his name. You don't name a dynasty after a ghost. Today, that chunk of black basalt sits in the Israel Museum. It's jagged, chipped, and incomplete, but it is one of the most powerful objects in the entire history of archaeology. It stands as a silent witness, a reminder that just because we haven't found the evidence yet doesn't mean it isn't there, waiting in the rubble, ready to speak.